So in 1997, Captain Michael Abrashoff took over the USS Benfold, which was one of the worst ships in all of the U.S. Navy. Already, the American Navy was facing a pretty big problem. Less than 50% of their sailors were re-enlisting after completing a tour of duty. Training new sailors was costing them at least $100,000, but not only that, it was costing them morale across the entire U.S. Navy. In an already struggling Navy, things were worse for the USS Benfold. When Abrashoff took over, it's actually really challenging to put into perspective how bad things were, but retention for sailors was less than 28%. Crew advancement and promotions was less than the Navy average, and ship performance on most tests were in the bottom 5% of the Navy. Within a year, though, the USS Benfold raised the retention rate from 28 to 100%. Promotions of the crew were twice that of the U.S. Navy average. They became the top performing ship in the U.S. Navy on nearly every metric. They were saving more money and they were more under budget than any other ship. And as Abrashoff shares in his New York Times bestselling book, It's Your Ship, they became the best damn ship in the Navy. The turnaround happened in only 1 year and with all 320 original crew members. It's an incredible story. And Abrashoff's book, it's not just one of my favorite leadership books, but it's been a favorite of coaches like the legendary Bill Walsh, who coached the San Francisco 49ers to 3 Super Bowls. The principles and strategies that Abrashoff used, they're applicable to us as coaches in sports. And we're really excited to share the conversation that we had with Captain Abrashoff a few months ago during the lockdown. The first part of our conversation, which is today's episode, Captain Abrashoff is going to share some principles and some strategies to help you if you're taking over a new program or you're just trying to reset the culture of your program this season. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, brought to you by Thrive on Challenge. I'm JP Nurbin, joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. Each week in about 30 minutes, we discuss important principles and strategies of transformational leadership. At Thrive on Challenge, we help coaches to raise the standards and strengthen the relationships in their program because we know this type of culture produces better leaders, better people, and better results. To learn more about how we can help you, go to thriveonchallenge.com, where you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter and get the coaching notes to every episode of this podcast. So, Mike, few people ever become a Navy ship captain, and I imagine very few of those then go on to write a New York Times best-selling book about their experiences. You've just got this incredible story, and I think what makes it really special is how coaches in sports actually really relate your experience to their own when they're taking over a new program or even just at the start of a new season.
So what's interesting is how I got assigned to my ship. I was the number 2 assistant to the Secretary of Defense. And during that time, the Naval Academy played Notre Dame in football in Dublin, Ireland for the first time ever. And my uncle, who has since passed, was a obnoxious, drunken Notre Dame graduate. And I know those terms are redundant, but he called me and said, I need 2 tickets to the game. And I said, who you taking? And he said, the president of the International Bricklayers Union. It sounded important to me. The Secretary of the Navy was a Democrat, pro-union. I call him up, Mr. Secretary, I need 2 tickets to the game. Who's going? President of the International Bricklayer Union and his guest. He gave me 2 tickets seated directly behind him and his wife on the 50-yard line. Game time rolls around. Bricklayer Union president is a no-show. To this day, I don't even know if there is an International Bricklayer Union or whether my uncle made it up. He shows up to the game drunk, sits behind the Secretary of the Navy in his seats, roots for Notre Dame, and Notre Dame won like 74-10. They come back to Washington. I got to come around up to SecNav's office. Bricklayer Union president, huh? He didn't show, but your uncle did, and he said, I'm going to get you back. And when my tour with the Secretary of Defense was up and I go back to the Navy Department, I get assigned to one of the worst ships in the Navy. And so that's how I got assigned to USS Benfold. And it wasn't the worst ship, but the biggest event of my life happened at the change of command ceremony when my predecessor was leaving the ship for the final time with his parents and his wife and his kids. And as his departure was announced on the public address system, my new crew stood and cheered at the fact that he was leaving. And in my entire career, I had never heard of or seen such a blatant sign of disrespect. And the first thought that went through my mind was, I don't want that to happen to me 2 years from now when I leave this ship. What do I need to do to change? And then I thought, you know what? I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to keep them safe. I'm here to get them to have a positive experience out of serving their time here. So I designed a culture where I would want my own son or daughter to come be a part of. And as part of that, I treated my people with respect. I listened to them. I interviewed every sailor individually, all 310 of them, and I got to know their names, their spouses' names, their children's names, their hometowns. And I kind of built them up and engaged them. And they started taking ownership. And they started taking personal responsibility for their actions. And they started working together as a team. And in 15 months, we get the trophy for being the best ship in the Pacific Fleet. And so that, in a nutshell, is the story.
Well, it's such a great turnaround, and you go through a lot of the important principles and details in the book, which we certainly recommend our readers check out. I kind of want to start our conversation today early in one of those opening chapters. I thought it was really interesting the way that you approached building that culture. You know, for us in the sports world, every coach that's out there has had the opportunity to start over or to start from the beginning when they first take over a program. And there's a lot of obstacles and challenges, regardless of how successful that program had been prior to that arrival. And I wondered if I could just share a couple of the principles that I felt like you walked in day one, kind of with some different assumptions about how you were going to approach your crew. And so I'm going to just give you a couple of these rapid fire, and I wonder if you could just speak on each one, maybe a paragraph or two about why that was important to you to have that outlook from the first day that you stepped on that ship. The first one that kind of jumped out to me was you assumed the best in others. Why was that important from the beginning?
Because there was a lack of trust both ways on that ship. And it was one thing that William Perry told me. He was the Secretary of Defense. My last day working for him, he brought me into his office, sat me down and said, Mike, no matter how hard you try, your ship is never going to be perfect. He said, you're going to have disappointments every day. He said, if you're ever disappointed in an outcome, I want you to remember one thing. He said, assume your crew wants to do a great job. And if you don't get the results you're looking for, don't blame them, but instead look inward and ask yourself, did you clearly communicate the goals to them? Did you give them the training? Did you give them the time and the resources to do a great job? But most importantly, did the process support them delivering the results you were looking for? So he shaped how I view disappointment as not blaming my people first, but instead assuming they wanted to do a good job and looking inward and see what I could have done differently or better.
The second principle that jumped out here is that you engaged everyone. Why was that important?
The world is facing, a very difficult situation right now. And people are off school, they're at home, and nobody knows, what's going on in people's homes right now. I just talked to, my sister an hour ago. She's depressed. In addition to, being out of work, it's raining and snowing in Pittsburgh. And like when we hopefully get back to normal and when we resume sports, it will be important for coaches, I think, to understand what their players have just been through. And every experience is going to be different. Some, their parents didn't get laid off. There's no financial pressure. They'll be doing fine. Others, may have had a lot of stress at home that if you don't take the time to find out about them, you'll never know what they've been through. And if you don't know what they've been through, you might not be able to connect with them in just the right way to get them back on track. When I interviewed every sailor on the ship, I tried to find out what their experience was and then use that knowledge to craft how I was going to interact with them. For example, I found one sailor who spent his whole life in and out of foster homes. And I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't asked. And so then, when dealing with that sailor in the future, I could envision what his life must have been like. And maybe he didn't have a positive role model. So that, if he didn't do something the right way, instead of berating him or demeaning him, understanding, and then use that knowledge to coach him just a little bit better. So I did that with every sailor. I knew their background. I knew whether they came from two-parent families, whether they had a bad childhood, and that helped me frame how I interacted with each sailor, because one size does not fit all when you're dealing with people, especially young people.
Well, I think what was most impressive about those conversations is it went beyond just personal connections, but you saw every one of those sailors, everybody that was under your care, as a source of maybe better information than when you could find on your own. One of the questions that comes up repeatedly is asking your people, is there a better way to do what you do? And another common theme here, an assumption it seemed that you began with, was it's worthwhile to question current practices, even if they've worked. Why did you come in with sort of that approach to question current practices?
Because sometimes things work and we don't know why they work. So whether it was a success or failure, we questioned what were the factors that went into that, so that we could understand why something was successful, so that we could get more of it, and also define why something was unsuccessful, so that we can do better in the future when we see the situation again. So we were constantly challenging every assumption and trying to understand all the things that went into the outcome that we were looking for.
Now, one of the other things I noticed as you were engaging in your people is that their experience really mattered to you, and probably the experience that they had before you started your leadership of this particular ship was probably evident in their applause for the former leader taking his walk off the plank there. But one of the things that you mentioned is creating a process that people will enjoy, and related to that is having fun for fun's sake. Do you want to talk a little bit about that in your approach?
Well, before I took command, our retention rate was abysmal. One of the lowest retention rates in the entire Navy. And when kids leave the military bitter, they go back to their communities and they counter recruit against us. They tell their family members and their friends and their cousins, oh, I had a terrible time in the Navy, don't do it. And so, we don't need people out there counter recruiting against us. We want people recruiting for us. So I wanted sailors, even if they left the Navy, to have had a positive experience, so that they can say, I got something productive out of my tenure there. You ought to go do it. And that's the same way with coaches. You don't want, if I were a coach, I wouldn't want former team members out there recruiting against me. And when I was at the Naval Academy, we had a baseball coach. I'm not going to mention his name. But if you took all the players who quit the baseball team because he was a tyrant, they would have beat the remaining players who stayed on the team. So there was a better team that left that were more talented and would have gotten better results than the people who stayed. It was because the coach drove them out, because he thought being a tyrant is part of the sport. And, it used to be okay to be a tyrant, but kids today know more than we did growing up. Through social media, through the internet, they now have access to what every other player is getting on other teams, and they want to be treated well as well. So we have to up our game as leaders, because being the tyrant just doesn't work anymore, in my opinion. And so to give you an example, my book, It's Your Ship, got a shout out in the 20 July 2018 edition of Sports Illustrated. And they were doing an article on the Philadelphia Eagles offensive line, and the Eagles had just come off the Super Bowl victory. And so they're interviewing the offensive line coach, Jeff Stoutland. And in the article, he said he used to be a my way or the highway hard ass. And then 5 years previous, somebody gave him a copy of It's Your Ship. And when he read it, he said, I need to up my leadership game. So in team meetings, the offensive linemen were allowed to raise their hand and give him suggestions and question techniques. And once they all started freely interacting, the players understood the game plan better. They work together better. They have the best offensive line. They go to the Super Bowl and win. And so that just goes to show you that those coaches who are actively engaging and improving their leadership skills, I think will be the ones that get the better results. And their players will have a more positive experience that will help them for the rest of their life if they do it.
Now, Mike, you had, I'm sure, many experiences leading up to your first ship that probably were influencing the way you approached it. Obviously, you had some of those principles that Nate just touched on there, which were some guiding principles as you took over Benfold. I think a lot of times as coaches, we walk into our first program or a new program, and we don't just have principles, but we have a vision. And we try to impose that vision on our team. And a lot of times I think that there's a great resistance. I know in my own experience, I just have this vision and it's just about selling that vision to my players. I feel like your approach was so much different than that. You didn't just try to impose this vision of what Benfold could be, other than you I know you use that mantra, the best damn ship in the Navy, but you really, like you've talked about here, you've empowered them to speak up and maybe articulate what they see the Benfold could be. I don't know if you could speak a little bit to that, of why you took that unique approach. Instead of coming in and having all the answers, you tried to get your sailors to be the ones that had the solutions and the answers.
I've seen time after time in the Navy where a new captain or a new department head come in and try to impose what worked on their previous ship. And every ship is different. And if you try to impose what worked previously, it may work, but I've seen more times it did not work because they didn't understand the culture. They didn't understand the team that was already there. So my advice and what I did was I made no changes for the first 30 days. I just listened. I asked questions. Why does it work this way? And I tried to understand the crew and the culture so that then I could be better informed, because I've seen it worked at my previous job. It's going to work here, without ever trying to understand the culture and what you already have there. So I would advise listening first, asking questions, and maybe what worked at the last job, maybe you have to do something a little bit different to connect with your new team.
And one of the ways that you did that, you mentioned earlier, was you sat down with 310 sailors and you had those one-on-ones. Two big questions come to mind is, how the heck did you find the time to talk with 310 people? And what were some of the things that you did in those one-on-ones to really get people to articulate what they were thinking, what they were feeling, to make some suggestions? Because I know so often we may ask questions of our athletes and they're going to be hesitant to speak up.
So the interviews were not an interrogation. Nobody had ever been inside the captain's cabin before. It was a mystery to them. So the first thing I would do is bring them in, make them feel at home. But when I worked for the Secretary of Defense, he created a program. It was after the Soviet Union had broken up. And he created a program. And when the Soviet Union broke up, Ukraine had 600 nuclear tipped missiles aimed at the United States, each with 10 warheads on it. So there were 6,000 nuclear tipped warheads directed at the United States in Ukraine. And he created a program to denuclearize Ukraine. And so we made 4 trips there. One to remove the nuclear warheads, and shipped them back to the U.S., one to remove the missiles from the silos so that they could never be used again. The third trip, we blew up the silos so that they couldn't be used again. And the fourth trip, we planted crops so that we turned this killing field into, farmland. And so for every trip, I had a photo commemorating it. And for one of my going away gifts, William Perry gave me this collection of 4 photos that I hung in my office on the ship. And so when a sailor would come in for an interview, I'd walk him or her around the room explaining the significance of each photo and how that contributed to the defense of our country. And then I was able to use that to connect with them and this is what you're doing that's contributing to our defense. So what I was trying to do was to connect them to a greater purpose. And I did that by being just conversational instead of it being an interrogation. And once they felt comfortable, then they felt free to open up. And we had great discussions about their backgrounds, their families, what they want to do with their lives. And that's what helped me to understand them so that we could then implement the culture that I thought necessary to make us the leader in our industry.
That's a really, really great example. I love that. It's just the intentionality that you had there to kind of, I don't know, show a little bit of yourself, that they could also connect with you, not just connect to a purpose. I think that's really unique.
And people want to know that you think you're human and that you're empathetic. And so that's what appeals to me. So I thought that would appeal to my crew.
You have established trust. You've built these relationships, or you're starting on that path. The next thing you do, you really want to empower them. And you talk about finding better ways to do everything. And you wanted to question everything. What were some ways that you started to really practically get people to speak up about changes that needed to be made all around the ship? Because there were some really unique changes you guys made that started to be implemented across every ship in the Navy, I believe.
Correct. So when I had a public address microphone right at my desk. And when I got a great idea in an interview with the sailor sitting right there, I would hit the button and I'd say, Benfold, this is the captain. This is the idea I just got. This is who I got it from. It makes sense to me. We're going to implement it right now. And that's how the crew knew I was serious, implementing some of these ideas that I could right on the spot. And so that caused them to trust me that they could bring me any idea. And, 30 or 40% of the ideas were quite honestly dumb, or that I couldn't implement them. But sometimes it led to better ideas. And what I don't want to do is stifle them thinking, because then all you create are robots. And I need people who, I need discipline, just like your coaches need discipline. But the way to get to discipline is when people feel personally connected and take personal responsibility, then discipline improves and they tend to follow the direction that you provide for them.
Now, in the book, you share a lot of examples of ideas that you kind of ran with. Do you think of one, maybe as JP mentioned, some of those ideas that came from your crew were adopted across the Navy? Is there one story that comes to mind you might be able to share with the listeners that came from one of those conversations?
So a sailor comes in. So once I started interviewing the crew, I started realizing how savvy and smart they were. So that led me to add 3 questions to the interviews. What do you like most about this ship? What do you like least? What would you change if you were the captain? And rule number 1 is you can't change the captain. I'm not going anywhere. But one sailor came in and says, do you know how many times we've painted this ship in the last 12 months? And I said, no. And he said, 6 times. And every time we paint the ship, it takes us a month to paint it. So every other month, we're painting this ship. He says to me, have you ever painted your home? And I said, yes. He said, it sucks, doesn't it? And I said, what's your point? We've been painting ships for 244 years. He said, did you ever stop to notice why we paint the ship every other month? Whenever a new piece of equipment is added topside to the hull of the ship, it's being held in place with nuts, bolts, screws, washers, and fasteners that are made out of ferrous metal that rust in salt water. And when it rusts, it streaks rust stains down the side of the ship. He said, "Have you ever heard of stainless steel?" When I said, "You mean the stuff that doesn't rust in salt water?" So for the first time in my career, I'd been in 16 years at this point, I stopped to look at this. And not only is it low value work, it's demoralizing work, and it's also dangerous work. I've got sailors hanging from the yard arm of a ship in a safety harness painting. I've got sailors hanging over the side of the ship in a harness painting, and this is inherently dangerous work. So we went on a crusade to change out every source of corrosion on that ship that we could with the right materials. I'm not going to get into the chemical makeup of every nut or bolt or washer, but we spent $25,000 in the project, changed out everything we could, painted the ship. We did not have to paint the ship again for the next 10 months. And we have a group in the Navy who build the ships, and they're based in Washington. They came out to the ship. The ship was 4 years old at that point, three years old. And they couldn't believe it. They said, "This ship looks better than the day it was delivered to the Navy," because we were smarter about attacking the sources of the corrosion as opposed to just attacking the corrosion. And so that program has been implemented on every ship in the Navy. They're now putting a cost to doing chipping and painting. And do they really want sailors spending their days doing that? Or would you rather have them thinking about how to defend ourselves better? And that's what I wanted. And that's what we got.
It's such a great example. And, for coaches that are sometimes faced with challenges that only their players can, provide some of that information and sometimes better solutions, I think it's just more encouraging of us to ask those questions of what would our players do differently? What do they like about what we're doing right now, and what would they do if they were the coach? I think those are tremendous questions.
Well, we've got even more of our conversation with Captain Abrashoff in next week's episode. We'll be unpacking how he created a great experience for his sailors. In the meantime, check out our Captains or Leadership Council System course on coachtube.com. CoachTube provides virtual training for coaches. So much great content on there that's easy for you and your staff to access. The Captains Council System is based on many of the principles of Captain Abrashoff, and it's a really powerful and simple way to implement some of the strategies he talked about in our conversation today. I will put a link to the course in this episode's details. It's also in the weekly newsletter, and I'm sharing frequently on Twitter. So check it out.